Okay. I see a lot of people are very excited about this event. So, good evening, everyone. So, hope you're having a great day. And to make it better, we have our much awaited session on Hacktoberfest. So, we are already having a speaker with us, and he has already shared some insights with us. For those of you who don't know him, Mr. Shivay Lamba is a program committee member at JS Nation. He's a GSoC mentor. He's also very active in our technical communities. I've seen him a lot in active on Twitter, LinkedIn. So yeah, he's also LFX mentorship mentor, and yeah, I guess he'll give you more insights about himself and introduction about himself. So for those of you who are new to this platform, Devi, so there might be some folks who are attending for the first time. So there is a general section and a Q&A section in our chat. So those of you who have any doubts regarding any thing that you are not able to grasp, you can send in the Q&A section. For other general chat, you can always uh, discuss and put your stuff in the general section. So I guess that's pretty much be handing over our session to our speaker. Okay,
All right.
sure. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Himank and Kushi, for organizing this session. And it's really good to see over 30 students coming in on a Saturday and Sunday, right? Because I know that college can be really hectic because of you're in the college from morning till evening, and then you have assignments and you have to study for exams, or prepare for internships and all. So
Hmm.
today's session is really going to be focused on how to get started with open source and a brief introduction about Hacktoberfest itself. But of course, what we cover today is not just limited to Hacktoberfest or what you are going to be doing during the month of October. It can be done anytime that you want. And that's what's the beauty of open source is all about. So the major focus of today's session will be on what exactly is open source, how can you get started with open source, and what are the prerequisites that you need in order to get started with open source, right? Because that's one of the most commonly asked questions. And and I'll also try to bust some of the myths that you might have, or some of the common questions that people have when they just get started with open source. So that will be the main agenda for today's session. And at any point of time, if you have any queries, please do let me know. Again, we'll try to make this session as interactive as possible. So don't consider this to be like your normal classroom lecture. And if you have any queries, feel free to reach out to me. You can ask in the Q&A section or in the general chat section as well. Try to probably ask your questions in the Q&A, because in the general chat section it might be sometimes possible that we might skip on a question. So we'll try to address as many questions as possible. And of course, if time does not permit, we'll take up some of these questions later on. So you can connect with me on my Twitter. I'm fairly active there, in case you are wanting to connect with me after today's session. So yeah, without wasting any further time, let me share my screen. By the way, Hemang, it does not show me the ability to share my screen. Can you enable the option? Oh,
Sure, sure.
okay, perfect. Okay,
Is
actually
it,
you're sharing. Yeah,
yeah, is it visible now?
yeah, it's visible. All right, is my screen visible to everyone?
It is.
Okay, perfect. So again, at any point of time, feel free to ask. I will take appropriate breaks in between, and we'll just take up some of the questions during that time. So yeah, I mean, let's get started. So today's session is primarily focused towards what exactly is open source, and we'll cover how Hacktoberfest is related to open source, and why open source is not just limited to the Hacktoberfest itself, but it's far beyond the Hacktoberfest, which all of you might have heard. And of course, this today's session is geared towards Hacktoberfest and open source. So this is what we are going to be covering. We'll be covering basically what is FOSS, and we'll come back to what exactly is FOSS and what does FOSS mean a bit later, and then how you can basically get started with FOSS, and how you can start contributing to FOSS, and what are some of the perks or benefits that you get when you contribute to open source. So first of all, let's just break down the two words that we have. That's open and source. So open means that it is open for everyone, right? So open source will not discriminate against basis on the basis of the gender, age of a person, or the location of a person. Whether you are in a remote part of Antarctica or in India, listening into this, watching this live seminar, anyone can contribute to open source. And source basically means that it's the source code, right? Every software, every product that you create that has code, it will have a source code. Now some source code will be proprietary, some of them will be open sourced. So for open source, that means that the source code is open and you can contribute to it. You can basically create new software on your own and collaborate with others without any discrimination, right? And we'll see, and we'll kind of like deep dive into what does that really mean. But what I would like to really talk about is that open source is not just limited to your standard software development. Open source is really a philosophy, and this philosophy can be applied to any aspect of life. The main idea is that this philosophy promotes the idea of redistribution and access to any particular product, design, or idea as well, which can be reshared, which can be implemented, and you're not putting like a copyright on this idea or this design, right? It can be reused and repurposed and by anyone, right? So that's the main idea. So you'll see open source as a philosophy being used everywhere around you, right? And it's not just limited to your software development. And one of the biggest differences between a closed source and an open source software. So just to kind of give a few examples of closed source software. So these include things like, if you are using the Microsoft world, or the operating systems, you'll have the general suite of Microsoft applications like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, right? These are paid softwares that you need to get a license key and you have to use them. Their source code, like the actual source code of the program, is it's a integral property of Microsoft, right? And it's not open for everyone. It's only accessible by the Microsoft employees. And similarly, we have Adobe suite of technologies and tools such as Photoshop, Adobe After Effects, and all. Again, these are all proprietary softwares, right? You purchase the license to be able to use them inside of your system, and their source code is not there to be shared with the public. Whereas with open source, and we'll be taking a look at some of these examples of open source software, and there are a lot of them today, right? Their primary idea is that the source code itself, that is what makes the software, it's open, right? And you're able to go ahead and contribute to it, take a look at it, or even like, let's say, create a local version of, a self-hosted version of that particular software on your own, right? Because the source code is actually open sourced. So the biggest difference between like open source and closed source is that open source is primarily driven by developer communities. There's not just, let's say, a team of 10 people working on Microsoft Word in a particular office within the Microsoft, right? An open source project will be contributed by developers and software developers around the world. So that would be developers from the US, Europe, India, and anywhere in the world. So it's more a developer community where multiple people of from different parts of the world are coming together and contributing to it, whereas the closed source is more in isolation within a particular company. So, what the biggest benefit that we get by having a developer community or such a large group of developers contribute to a particular project is that bug discoverability, and then actually going ahead and fixing those bugs or discovering of vulnerabilities in the code is much more quicker. And of course, like, because there are contributors around the world, these bugs tend to get resolved very quickly. Whereas, let's say, if there are 10 engineers in the US who are working on one software, there might not be any other software, and if there's something that, like, goes wrong, you'll have to wait when they come back in the morning to be able to fix them, because they have limited resources and limited personnel. Securing and resolving of bugs and issues takes a bit more longer, right? And of course, the other benefit is that you get to be part of a global community of developers, so interacting with them, and of course you get the ability to view and modify the source code of an application, whereas it's not possible in closed source. So far we have spoken about open source, right? But let's move a step further and talk about free and open source. So what does free mean? Free does not just, it's not just limited to the freedom, like I mean free of cost basically, right? Generally a lot of open source softwares are free of cost, but the free terminology also basically applies on how you plan to use and modify that application. So you have freedom to use this application. You can use it from wherever you want, at what, whenever you want, right? You can modify that application, and you can then, once modified, you can also distribute it, right? You have that, all of that freedom. It's not just like limited to being free of cost. With closed source software, like you cannot redistribute the software. You don't have the ability to actually modify it. It's discouraged. And of course you don't have access to the source code. You cannot do that. So those are some of the things to keep in mind when it comes to FOSS, right? We are talking about free and open source. And there's a very famous statement by Linus Torvalds, who is the creator of the Linux kernel and Git, which we'll be talking about what exactly is Git today. So he says that in real open source, you have the right to control your own destiny. So what does that mean? Is that in open source, you don't have any restrictions by the company where you're working, right? You can basically contribute to discussions and contribute to code, because open source is not just like limited to the software code itself. There are a lot of planning that goes on, right? Every week or every month, depending on the open source projects, there are uh, planning meetings where all the community members discuss and see what is the next step towards like building and making like better experience based on that particular technology or software. So you have the destiny, like to be able to build whatever you want, right, in open source. And of course there are a few criterias for which softwares need to follow in order to be classified or be termed as open source. So they should be free, they should be open in terms of like access, how many number of times you want. You can modify it, you can use it anywhere and at any point of time, right? And you can reuse it. Like there are no 10 trial versions of being able to use that particular software. And one of the biggest reasons like why one should embrace open source and why should one adapt to open source. So let's take a quick look at that, right? So the first one is the quality, right? So since we have so many developers contributing, and all these developers have varied level of experiences and they're contributing to a particular project, so you get a sense of quality and reliability, because bug fixes, security vulnerabilities, those get resolved quicker in most times when you are dealing with open source softwares. Then of course you get adaptability and customization by remodifying one of the existing open source softwares according to your own use case that you can start using. And then you can run it anywhere from any point of the world, right? And of course the biggest one that I feel personally is the community, right? Because there's such a large community. Some of these open source projects have more than 100,000 people contributing to that particular project. So you get to be a part of that global community, and in case you run into any issues, there are community members who will help you in order to resolve these issues, and then you'll be able to contribute. So those are some of the benefits that one should that one gets by embracing open source. And these are, of course, just some of the examples. This probably is not even 0.0000001% of all the softwares that are there that are open source today. So you have things like programming languages like Python, Java, PHP, and then softwares like Mozilla Firefox, which is a web browser, right? Then WordPress, Ubuntu, which is a flavor of Linux operating system. So you see all of these different softwares which are open source, right? And let's just take a look at the open source development model, right? So normally, if you are like, let's say, working in a company, you do an internship. There's a vertical hierarchy that is usually followed, right? So you start at the top with the directors, board of directors, and the CEO, right? And then you'll have senior managers, junior managers, and then software developers, interns, right? So you'll have that kind of a vertical hierarchy, and depending on where exactly you are at the hierarchy, you'll have more and more say in the company's functioning and in the projects. So as a lead architect for the project, you will be responsible for leading all the initiatives that lead to it, right? And of course, with open source, there is no such kind of a vertical hierarchy, right? It's completely flat structure. So what does this mean? That everyone, right? Everyone is a volunteer or a contributor to that particular project, right? And anyone can come and contribute, and anyone can discuss ideas as well, right? So you're free to discuss ideas, share suggestions. There's no vertical hierarchy, right? There is usually a project leader or a maintainer. They are just individuals who have contributed to, like, that particular project for such a long time that they are deemed fit to be able to also mentor others, and go ahead and ensure that like those issues get resolved. So and within the open source development model, it's a very flat hierarchy, right? There's no hierarchy at all, actually. So everyone is a contributor, and everyone can give their feedback and share access. So that's the main difference between the development model of an open source software and then others. um, and then why contributing to open source is important, like why one should embrace, and this is especially useful for all of you. So the first one is that you get real world software development experience. Now a lot of these open source softwares, right, they are being used by millions of companies, right, or probably millions of users. An example of that is let's say the VLC media player, right? So the VLC media player is a very popular media streaming application. Now it's open source completely, right? So it's completely open source, and if you, let's say, contribute to it, so since it's a very mature project, right, you learn a lot of different techniques, best practices when it comes to basically pushing your code, or like let's say some of the best practices when it comes to specific syntax inside of your code, right? And that helps you to have a better experience, and that helps you to understand what are also the standards and what are the best practices when it comes to software development being used in the industry, right? So that gives you real world software experience, because of course, if you're not, let's say, ready for an internship in your third or fourth year, right, then you can always contribute to open source and still be able to actually get real world software development experience. So that's something that's important. And then of course, there's a community around the community factor, and probably the biggest one is the satisfaction that you get. Let's say you basically pick up an issue that has fixed like a lot of users, and you're able to go ahead and resolve that particular issue. Then there is no bigger satisfaction that you might get, because of the fact that what we have done is that we took something that is being affecting, let's say, millions of users, and you fix it, and now it's effective again, right? So those are things that really give you a lot of satisfaction, and that's what we also recommend that you should actually do. And as you're contributing to open source, just be very vocal about it, so that other people can also get to know what kind of contributions are being made. So I hope that makes sense. Now before we step into how to basically get started with open source, and later on we also discuss about Hacktoberfest, if anyone has any questions till now, feel free to ask, and I'll be more than happy to take up any questions so far, if anyone has any questions.
So, two questions in the Q&A section.
All right. So Sashwat is asking, from a business point of view, if I want to develop my software by open source community, preserving the differentiating factor which separates the software from the similar ones. Now that's a really good question, because most companies and most people that I interact with, which are having a closed source software, they usually end up asking why should we open source? So it's a very, I have a couple of reasons for that, and the biggest one is probably Microsoft. So Microsoft in 1998 mentioned that open source cannot sustain in the world. They mentioned this, like it's very famous. This was, I'm not sure if exactly the same line, but very similar to this, that they mentioned that open source cannot exist because of the fact that you're making it open source, and so what will happen, right? People will start copying it. But in 2018, 20 years later, they ended up purchasing GitHub, right? They bought GitHub for billions of dollars, which is the world's largest open source GitHub experience, right? Repository where you can find. So that's the difference that we're kind of looking at, right? In terms of the approach. The idea is that when you open source a software, there are so many contributors who basically join and can actually help you build your project better, right? As compared to, let's say, even if you were building it internally. Now that doesn't mean that if you're doing it just internally and you'll not get success if you don't open source it. But the idea is that the biggest one is you get community feedback, you get community support, you get real time feedback from users about the project, right? And in case there are any bugs, it's very easy to find out bugs in case those are being kept, right? So that's like one of the reasons why it is there. Now of course, it's understandable from an intellectual property, but today what we are seeing is that even for closed source softwares, a lot of people are basically building open source alternatives, right? So for example, keeping it relevant to the Google developer student clubs, we have Firebase. Now I hope a few of you might have heard about what Firebase is, right? It's a backend as a service. Now there are number of open source alternatives to just the Firebase, right? And like there is nhost, for example, and a number of other ones as well. So the idea is that these tools basically, or these open source alternatives, they are great to expand the ecosystem and give more preferences to to the audience or to the attendees, right, who are basically going to be using that software, or who are basically like even working professionals who are working. So I hope that answers your question, Sashwat. So idea is that yes, it does make sense from a business point of view that why one should want to open source their what would be the biggest differentiating factor. But I hope this these arguments help you in basically making that call. Probably I don't see any other questions, so we can move to the next section. And basically the next section is stepping into the FOSS world. That once now we are aware that what exactly is the FOSS, right? It's free and open source. And I'll just turn on my camera in just a second. So we are aware that what exactly is FOSS, right? Now, of course, the next question that we get is that how do you step into it, right? What are the prerequisites? What are the ways in which you will basically be able to contribute and get started with FOSS, right? So that's the, of course, the immediate question. So let's take a look at how basically you do get started with open source, right? Specifically FOSS development. Now there are immediately some prerequisites that you need to be aware of, and today we'll take a look at a few of them. So the first one is Git, right? Just as a vote of show of hands, how many of you are aware what Git is? I'm not sure if there's like a hand raise icon, but you can probably fill in the chat in case you are. So just type in the chat if you are aware of what Git is, or if you're not aware. So if you're not aware, you can still type in the chat that you haven't heard. If you're hearing about Git for the first time, anyone there who is hearing the term Git for the first time? Okay, so I see that majority of the folks are aware, but there are still few who are not aware. So we'll also do a quick demonstration of basically what Git is and how to get started with it. But of course, we'll share some tutorials that you can follow and that will help you with your open source journey. So, coming back to the slide, right? So the prerequisites that we require in order to get started with open source, and this is apparent. You definitely require this if you want to become good at open source development. So the first one is being knowing about Git. So Git is basically a distributed version control system. So think about it in this way: that whenever you have so many people who are contributing to a particular project, right? There could be two people contributing to a project, a single person contributing to a project, or there could be 20, 30, 100 people contributing to a project, right? So the idea is that if there are so many people contributing and there could be multiple features that people are building, right, it's important to keep a track of understanding that who made what change at what time, right? Because there could be times where you make some change and that does not get reflected, right? So basically with Git, what we do is that we keep a track of what changes are being made at what point of time is being made, all of that, right? So it's basically a free and open source distributed version control system that helps to essentially go ahead and be able to ensure that we are able to capture, in case there are multiple people working on a project, then how we are able to handle and store things such as the logs, or even who pushed what code at what point of time, right? You are aware of that. And in case there is anything wrong inside of your program, you can go back to one of the previous previous instances, and then again reuse that. So just some things to keep in mind when it comes to learning Git. So if, in case you want to basically get started with Git, there is a very useful tutorial that is provided over here, and I'll share this in the slide as well with everyone. So basically, this is the tutorial that you can follow along. Again, it's a very useful tutorial. But the main idea is that with Git, what you do is that you initialize the project, right? And then you can have multiple contributors to that particular project. That's just something to keep in mind. So now what we'll do is that we'll just take a look at how you can get started with Git, like a quick intro into how you get started with Git, right? So basically, for installing Git, you just go to Git SCM. That's the website. So Git-SCM, and just download it for your system. So you can basically just go ahead and install it for your system. So this will generate the ability to actually start using Git, right? Now over here, I have a terminal open, and once you've basically successfully installed Git, if you use the Git command, you should be able to use it, and you can also take the version of the Git that you have installed. So in this case, mine is 2.33.0. So yeah, I mean, this is what is Git, right? And now we'll sort of see that how we basically get started with Git. So any particular project where we want to basically use Git, right? We first define the git init command, which is used to initialize a Git folder. So let me go to one of the folders that I created for today's session, and that's the Hacktoberfest session. And what I'll do is I will say git init. And basically what it does is that it essentially creates this empty Git repository, right? And you can see that it's from the .git folder. If I try to just do ls, which in Mac and for for the Ubuntu based systems, Linux based systems, it basically lists all the different folders that are there. But in case you want to also find hidden information, that's ls minus a, right? So my bad. Yeah. So you can see over here that we have the .git folder. So if I go to the .git, you can see that there are a bunch of these different files. All of will not go too deep into what all these different files mean, but all of these files are responsible for basically storing the information on what was served at what time, right? And then especially related to the fact that when it comes to being able to, let's say, keep a track or log of what changes were being made at what time, again all of that is managed with the help of the Git, right? So we just initialize the Git, and then we can basically start contributing to a particular project with Git. So if we just quickly go back to this particular section which we have, right? So we can go to this tutorial very quickly. And there are a number of different starter there are a number of different starter commands that you can use in order to basically get started. But the main idea is that the way Git basically works is that it starts and for that I'll let me bring up xcalidraw. So the idea is that your Git starts from somewhere, right? So let's say this is my original so let's say that this particular block is my initial code, right? So it's the initial, it's number one, and this is where we are basically writing the logic, right? This is where we are writing the logic, and again, for it to either get switched on or it gets switched off, right? So that's something to keep in mind. So the idea is that over here, currently our commit is pointing towards this contribution that is being made. Now if there are further contributions being made, then what will happen is that the head, that's again a nomenclature to know where exactly you are, right? If that is we make some changes to it, then there will be new changes added to this particular link, right? Because it will be acting on top of your existing one. So basically this way what will happen is that in case there is some change being made, This will be like the second part, right? And this will be the second, and then similarly we'll have multiple. So the idea is that we shift our focus from whatever is the current state to the next one, depending on whatever changes are being made, in order to keep track of whatever latest changes are being conducted, right? So the example that I gave is of course a very simple example. You can have multiple branches where you could have people at the same level, right? They began at the same time, but they are working on completely different tasks, right? So it kind of depends from from person to person. And then of course for what is the software that you're building, what is it made up of. So it kind of also depends there, right? And how basically your software development would basically look like. So there are a number of different commands that we have, and of course in order to get started, right, we have some basic commands. So of course git init is used to just initialize a git repository. Now let's say if I create and I'll go to this particular folder again, back to this folder. So I'm right now in my Hacktoberfest main main repository. So let's say that I create a new folder and I'll call it let's say hello.txt. So if I see we have the hello.txt, and now let's go ahead and edit it, and I'll say hello from India, let's say, right, and I'll save it. So if I take a look at what exactly is there inside of this file, let's just take a look at the hello.txt, and you can see that it prints the output. Now, of course, what has happened is that during this time when we initialized the Git repository, right, there have been a few changes that have been made, right? So we what we have done is that there are a few changes that have been made over here, as you can see very clearly. Now the next thing that we are going to be doing is that we want these changes to get reflected inside of our Git, so that other people can also take a look at that. So this is the stage where our changes are untracked. That means that Git is not aware what all changes have been made. Now we have to basically make them. So the command that we use in order to do that is the git add command, right? So the git add command is used for that, and then either you can give which particular file do you want to be remembered and then be booked early, right? So let's say what all changes are being are needed to be added to your list of changes that need to be shown to Git, right? So we can either give, let's say, the name of the individual files that we want, or if let's say whatever changes that you have made so far, if you want all of those different changes to be added to Git, right, you can use the dot symbol. So for now, since I've only made one file, which is hello.txt, so I'll just go ahead and add that. So now basically what has happened is that there are primarily three different stages, right, that are there inside of Git. And just let's just understand that. So this is, let's say, your untracked area, right? So basically this is the untracked area, right? And here, let's say, is the main Git. So basically what happens is that when we use the git add command, we are and you can also find information on what exactly is the add. So what we are doing specifically doing is that we are staging a particular change, and what it does is that it will basically take a snapshot of the entire changes that you have basically made, right? So because what has been happening so far is that you have been working off locally, right? You have been working locally so far, and Git basically wants to know that what changes you have made. So when what you do is that you use the git add command. Basically Git will take a snapshot of all the changes that have been made in this time, and it will come into this staging area, right? So staging area is like this kind of a temporary area where Git knows that yes, you have some code that you have also edited and you have some changes, but it has not been added yet to the main log, right, that is being maintained. So this is the git add. Now the next step is that, okay, you have gone through the changes and you feel that it's correct. Then what we can do is that we can use the git commit command, right? So basically the git commit, what it says is that yes, I accept that these changes are true, so we can go ahead and run this, right? So we can say git commit. And basically whenever we are giving a commit, we also provide a commit message. that basically is useful to just understand, like, what are the changes and what are the things that are happening right now. So we'll give, like, the git commit with the hyphen m, which stands for message, and then we'll give that. So let's say that, like, the message that we want to portray is that we added, like, hello .txt, right? So we can say that this is the one, and then we'll go ahead and commit this, right? So as you can see, what it does is that it basically creates this, like, commit id, right? Where it says that, okay, what was the commit message and what has been the commit that has been made, right? So this is the main idea, right, behind this, that we have basically used the git commit command, right? And that has created a commit id, and this way, like, whenever someone basically wants to add some changes to, like, this repository, then of course everyone is making a new commit id, right? Or basically a way to understand, like, whether it's correct or not, right? So once we have done this, the next thing that we'll go ahead and do is that we will push these changes, and for that we basically use the git push command. So of course right now what's happening is that we are basically working off locally, but in most cases what will happen is that you'll have a remote server, right? So basically the idea is that you'll have a remote server somewhere, right? So this is our remote server, and let's say that this is hosted in the US. So this is a remote server. Now basically what will happen with this remote server is that there will be multiple contributors, right? There will be, let's say, contributor 1, contributor 2, contributor 3, there will be contributor 4, and all of these different contributors are contributing in, like, their own fields and their own areas. So of course it's not like, possible to be able to make that call, right? And that's why, like, people are also like, how usually we handle is that you have your central code repository, and this remote server is where our entire source code is, like, stating, and then we can clone that particular software locally, right? And then make changes to it. Now even if you have used the git commit command, right, it has added your changes to, let's say, a list of changes that is by provided by GitLab. But of course it's also important to understand that, like, this is going to be basically, the idea is that with this remote server, we'll have more number of contributions coming up, right? So just something to keep a track of, right? In terms of, like, how it's going to be structured. So I hope that like, answers some of the questions that you might probably have in mind. So it's just the remote server. Yeah. uh, so coming back, like, to our, like, idea about git push, right? So let's go ahead and use that. And oh, of course, right, before we basically push something, we also need to add the remote url, like, where exactly do we should be added, like, and definitely you should, right? So if you're having, let's say, a international airlines, then, like, or, like, let's say you have people working internationally, then you'll have to add the remote url of, like, you'll have to add the remote url of that particular source code or the repository, right, that is hosting that code, and everyone around the world is contributing to it. So you'll have to add the remote, and then only you'll be able to push those changes. And once you push those changes finally, then it will be accessible to everyone around the world. So usually that's, like, the most basic commands, and of course there are a number of other commands that are also there, right? So we have things like the git clone, which is used to basically clone a repository that is hosted somewhere in the cloud, and then you are able to use it remotely, right, locally in your system. And of course there is this entire concept of branches, right? Branches basically allow you to work, like, instead of, like, everyone working in a single file, what branching allows you to do is that basically you can take a single project, and, like, from that same instance of the project you can have branch 1 and branch 2, where you can work on different things, right? So let's say an example could be that one developer is working on the front end, whereas the other developer is working on some other feature. So this way what will happen is that without interfering with each other's work, you can work, like, exclusively within your own branch, and that will not interfere with others, or others in the branch. So I hope that also makes sense. But any questions so far with respect to, like, what we have covered yet? Again, in case you have any questions, feel free to, like, ask your questions in the Q&A section. So in case you have any questions, feel free to ask. And I'd like to just probably take a pause for a couple of minutes and answer any of the questions that you might have with with Git. Again, by no means this is a full session on how to get started with Git. But yes, it is enough so that you understand how what you have to basically learn, right? And why is it important to learn Git? That's mainly that if you want to contribute to projects that the public and multiple people are contributing, then Git is what is used for the project management and being able to do collaborative contributions to projects. So we'll just take some of these questions. So the next question I think is by Aksh, who's asked why people don't use CLI to commit the code instead of Git UX. So in case you're asking for committing, right? So of course, I mean, some people prefer to use GitHub, and we'll come back to GitHub in a bit. But I do see actually a lot of developers using the CLI as well. So I'm not entirely sure. I mean, if you have probably seen, and it might be more common with people who are just getting started with Git and GitHub, that they probably are just using the software and the GitHub web UI to be able to make these. But of course, I we personally also a lot of developers use the CLI as well as their preferred choice of using Git commands. And then Aksh is asking, I always commit in open source using git status git add. Okay, so you're asking, Aksh, could you probably just rephrase the question, or just probably add more context into the last question that you have added, which is I always commit in open source using git status git add, git status git commit, um, git push. I mean, usually the process is like this, that you would want to know that if there are some new changes that have come in, right? So you might want to basically pull those changes in, and then only make sure that you commit some changes. So that's a good practice to do. So again, I'm not entirely sure what's the question. um, Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. So basically the git add dot, right, as I mentioned. So if you're using the git add dot, what that does is that it will basically take all the different files that you have, right? Of course, in my case, I just had one example. But let me if I go ahead and create a new shell, right? I'll create a new window, and I'll go to, let's say, one of these other examples. Let's say I go to the state operator, right? So here, you have all these different files. Now, if I make one change to one of these files, then of course it's fine. But if I make a number of different changes, then it's also confusing for the system, right? So I hope that answers the query. So instead of just being able to randomly push any file changes, we just want to do very selective file changes that we want to push, right? That's the main reason. So I hope that answers. Okay, great. Any other questions so far? Otherwise, we'll proceed further. All right, doesn't look like that we have any other questions right now. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, right? Okay, let's go ahead and look at this further. So of course, the first prerequisite is that you learn Git. Now, some of the other ones is that, of course, if you are willing to contribute to, let's say, an open source project, then having a basic understanding of at least one programming language is really important. So because open source projects can be in multiple languages, they can be in C, C++, or any language that you can think of. So at least just understanding basic knowledge about, or basic understanding of that particular language is important. And even if you just have basic intermediate, you don't have to be an expert by any means. Even if you're just a beginner, even then you can contribute, right? That's the main thing that we want to share in this. So the idea is that you have to know Git, that will help you to contribute, and then of course some technology, right, that can be used. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Of course, this is a skill. I'll recommend you to basically take a screenshot of this particular page, if in case you're interested to do so. Now, of course, the question is that how and when to start contributing, right? Because this is probably the most commonly asked question, that how should one start contributing, and basically when should they start contributing? Should they contribute when visiting, let's say, the US, or should they contribute only in their college, or when they're attending when let's say they're attending a hackathon, right? When should we start first? So my simple answer to that question is that you can start first, right now, today itself, right? Create an account on GitHub or any other code hosting platform and start building software that is open source, right? So that's definitely possible. And again, the idea is that you can start with yourself. You don't have to wait for your first ever open source project, the external project to contribute to and ask. Like, you can do that automatically. So I hope that answers the question. Again, like, if there is any question so far, feel free to ask. Let me bring this up. All right. So the idea is that even if you're building a personal project and it is basically open source, then that is an open source contribution. And you can also collaborate with friends on project management skills and how you can collectively build software together as a single entity. So that's all something that you can do, right? So I hope that makes sense to everyone. And of course, like every open source project should have a release cycle, right? So basically things like having an appropriate license, right? Then issues, right? And then releases. All of these are primarily focused on making the lives of software engineers and whoever is looking at a software that is being open source. These are some of the things that do come in handy. I hope that answers. Again, if any if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And then we'll probably skip this particular process, this part. But the idea is that, okay, now we have understood, right, that and let me actually give you an example, right? So basically the main tool that you can use in order to create open source projects is something like GitHub, right? So what exactly is GitHub? GitHub is your basically it provides you ability, or it basically provides you a platform to be able to host open source code. So let's say if I create a new repository right now on GitHub. Again, if you are not signed up on GitHub, then you can just go to github.com and you'll be able to sign up very quickly within 5 minutes. So what you can do is I'll select, let's say, myself as the owner. And if I create a new repository, right? So let's say if I create a new repository as GDSC, right? If I make something like this, and if I give a description that this is Amity GDSC event, right? This is event, and then let's say now you have two options. One is the public version and the other one is the private version. So with private, it's not open source, it's closed source. But with public, it is definitely open source, right? So this is the this is the event that is there. And if I make it public, then it will be publicly accessible by everyone. So I can go ahead and just create this software. And you can see, right, that we are already done. Now, of course, you can do whatever you want with this particular repository, right? And then that's what is the idea. So again, in case of any questions, again, do feel free to reach out, and I'll be more than happy to conduct sessions. But yeah, any questions so far from what we have covered so far in terms of what are the tools, and then take a look at this. Any questions for anyone? I don't see any questions. Oh, okay. There is actually. What are the fundamental requirements to have an open source in order to start an open source project? So, see, the most important things that you should have, right? And that's primarily that you have you have the repository itself. Now, one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that the readmes of projects are super important. And how do readme looks like? So basically, I'll show an example. If I go to github.com/layer5io, let me go to one of these projects. So basically the idea is that some of these projects can be very large, right? Very large in size. So sometimes you might want to give installation guidance, right? Where exactly are you looking at? And then of course all this. So the idea is that all of the information regarding all the information that we need, right? It's being stored inside of the README, right? So the README is like this go-to guide where you can find information on how to install, how to contribute, and understand like what that particular project does. So yeah, uh, I hope that that makes sense to everyone. Right. So yeah, basically that's the main idea. So of course, depending on which particular type of project that you might have, like there will be separate links for all these. So yeah, like that's one of the biggest things that you need, right? A good README which basically covers what the project is all about, how to install the project, how to contribute to that project. Then what you also need is basically like, let's say, your mockups, and of course if you can create, let's say, a GitHub discussion, right? So basically GitHub discussion is an open forum that you can open for any repository, and then you can have technical discussions with others, right? So that's also like an equally impressive one. So yeah, do let me know if anyone has any queries so far. All right. So if everyone is clear, and again, just as a vote of hands, right? Is everyone like understanding what we have covered so far? Again, would love to know from everyone if you're enjoying the session so far, and like if it's clear to everyone. If you can just probably type in the chat. All right, perfect. All right. So yeah, basically the idea is that when you are contributing to an open source project, right? These are some of the things that are definitely needed. So you need things like the README, right? And then of course we covered some of the other things, right? So the idea is that all of these also do help, right? So basically, whenever we create any open source project, every open source project will have a number of issues attached to it, right? And you can basically assign yourself, or ask that you might be assigned to one of these issues in case you want to work on them and fix them yourself, right? So those are also some of the things that we need to probably take in mind with respect to making ensuring that we have a good one, right? So yeah, basically that's one of the main parts. So now basically moving on to the process of that, how shall you select, like what's the process of basically selecting projects that you wish to contribute to. So of course the first thing that you mentioned is that you don't have to wait specifically to learn the specific skill sets. But of course it's always good to foster connection, right? And you can get started with your open source journey by contributing to a personal project, right? And even that can be considered as an open source project, right? And now basically moving into the fast development, right? So basically the idea is that again, different type of different type of softwares are basically getting launched in different organizations and in different projects. So you just have to search a bit more, right? And find that which particular software or which particular it's the most applicable for you, right? So the idea is that whenever we talk about like the approach, right, that how should you approach the again, it's not just limited to one particular platform, but first find the platforms, right? So basically with the other areas that are covered, and first thing that you start to do is that you find an organization where you want to work, right? And then of course it's there, and then finally you're giving basically you're finding, okay, which particular organizations are working in this field and what's some of the latest values, and then you basically go ahead and start interacting, right? With the developers, with the maintainers of that particular project, which again will be used to send and understand like how these particular softwares are basically working, right? So you'll start interacting with the developers to understand like how do these work behind the scenes, and then finally you'll basically make the contribution. So the idea is that, and how should we select a particular project or a organization. So basically there are two different main types of operations, right? So, or basically two different type of approaches. So the first one is how you can basically write the and again, there are two different approaches that we have. One is the top down approach and the other one is the bottom up approach. So the top down approach is basically that you learn certain skill sets, right? And then based on those skill sets, what will happen is that you will be able to choose an organization, right? So um, similarly, with learn the skills, right? Over here with the bottom up approach, you are basically first learning the skills that you are passionate about, and then you are able to find projects that basically are you are choosing the projects that you have, right? So in the bottom up approach, what's happening is that it's the reverse, right? So with the bottom up approach, you are really passionate about a particular project, and then what happens is that you try to learn the specific technologies that are there inside of that particular project, and then you are able to use that bottom up approach. So whether you're applying for an organization, or like let's say you're just looking out for open source projects, right? Again, another really great website is like GitHub, where you can just simply search for terms such as like that you can use in order to also gain some more, right? uh, I hope that answers some of the questions, or if there are any queries, again feel free to ask those queries in the Q&A. And so the idea is that how many organizations or projects should you choose, right? So that totally depends on how many organization, right, that you want to contribute to. So of course it's directed in such a way. So that is the main point. Then of course, if we take a look at what to basically do after choosing the organization, right? Once you have chosen a project that you wish to contribute to, what are some of the things that should be done? So basically for that, this is already done, right? So now basically we'll move on to that. Once you have identified that yes, like this is the project that you want to contribute to, then what next needs to be done, right? So first thing is that you'll basically introduce yourself to the the Slack or whatever communication channel that they might be using, right? So every open source project will have some kind of a communication channel. It could be the email RFC, or it could be the leader. And then you basically start searching for projects where there are some beginner friendly issues, and you search for them, and then it's done like that. So this is the main point behind that particular file. Yeah. So these are the main three things that are required in order to successfully integrate. And then of course the main idea is that there might be situations where in case you're getting confused regarding the separate metrics, right? Then of course those can also be taken care of. Now of course, just understanding, right, the idea is that you should start right now, right? You shouldn't contemplate much. Again, initially you might have some error in terms of how it works, but yeah, the idea is that you start today itself, right? You're not waiting for someone, you'll start today itself. And this is the kind of the developer cycle that you kind of look at whenever you're contributing to open source. So you first start to look out for open issues, and then you fix that issue in a reasonable amount of time, and then the pull request gets accepted. And of course, a lot of times you might have this inferiority complex that others are succeeding, but you're not. So of course, in that case, just um, ensure that you actually don't doubt yourself, right? Because of course everyone has a slightly different involvement, and that's what is there required. So yeah, again the main idea is that now in order to support open source in students, right, there are a number of different open source initiatives that have been created, right? So basically, programs like Hacktoberfest, and this will be basically talking about Gold Summer Code, the Winter of Security, right? All of these are basically these sessions that have been created, right? and like basically they have been made specifically for uh, the user, right? So they have been specifically for this. So now what basically means, like what does mean is that once this is done, right, the then basically can start contributing to any one of these particular projects and take a look at them. And then finally coming back to what is the Hacktoberfest. So the Hacktoberfest, of course, it has the original hope coming from like the word orchestrate, right? So basically the Hacktoberfest is the month of similar to how we have the one that takes place in Spain, right? Similarly we have this Hacktoberfest that takes place worldwide. And in terms of the uh, main point, like what exactly is GitHub Universe. So it's a celebration of 30 days on open source. So the GitHub team gives you four different uh, basically the main idea is that it will give you ample amount of opportunities to be able to learn open source, right? And then of course go ahead and being able to, let's say, and of course like this example is from 2020, but of course right now we're for 2022. So every year during the month of May, there are a number of different sessions that are planned, and they are basically used for being able to do all of these things, right? Being able to contribute to open source. It's during the month of October that you can contribute, and you have to basically sign up on the Hacktoberfest website, and basically be able to make four uh, basically at least two changes, right? And then of course the main idea is that with the Hacktoberfest, you have to basically submit four pull requests by signing up for the event, right? And these four pull requests, again, I'll recommend you to take a look at the Hacktoberfest website, which are having specific. Let me just open this up. So I'll recommend you to specifically take a look at what are what are some of the things, right? Because normally what happens is that a lot of people start spamming messages, right, for everyone. So what I'll recommend is that first you also read through some of the do's and don'ts of doing that, in case you're not. So that's the main idea behind this one, right? All right, I hope this makes sense, right? So the main idea is that with the Hacktoberfest, we are trying to promote open source. We are trying to promote open source culture, right? And we are trying to bring more people into open source. Now, when it comes to the Hacktoberfest, the main idea behind Hacktoberfest is that it's not trying to convey that open source is only prevalent during the month of October, but it's meant for bringing in more people into this field, right? And the main or the biggest essence of Hacktoberfest is that we want more people, right? And then of course when it comes to understanding that how basically Hacktoberfest works. So the main agenda is not the swags or the whatever you have. The main agenda is that once you make those four pull requests, you should grow further, right? So that's something just to keep in mind as well. That's the major essence of how Hacktoberfest basically works, right? And again, the idea is that you have so much amount of point that of course it will be recommended you start contributing, right? So that's the main point, that it's that Hacktoberfest is not just limited to October itself, right? You can work and you can participate in Hacktoberfest around the entire year, right? Entire year. So Hacktoberfest is not just limited to October, right? That's one of the biggest takeaways from open source. Now, basically, there are of course a lot of different perks as well that you get by contributing to open source. So, of course, if you are part of programs like Google Summer of Code, LFX mentorship, right? You get great stipends and you get to actually work under the mentorship of a few mentors, and then you're able to go ahead and work on them. And then you basically are getting an experience of being able to, let's say, working on a like basically the real world projects through open source, and you get to also travel to various like conferences over here, right? So that's also some of the things that you can take a look at in terms like what are the benefits, because people want to know if like you have built some really great software and how did you build that open source software. So people want to basically know about all of that. So those are some of the perks that you basically have. And these are some of the conferences that are basically open source conferences that you can also attend in case you're interested to know. Again, if you are interested to know, you can interact with me as well, and you can ask me questions if you have any. And those sound like the biggest benefits. But of course, what will not happen is that even if you're a open source recruiters are not going to be looking at that. But of course, it is very important to have that, because you still need to know the fundamentals of computer science if you want to become a good software developer. So what we have learned so far is that the main idea of open source is that it basically pertains to a group of contributors who basically recognize the need of that particular software, and anyone and everyone in the entire world can basically contribute to it, and you can basically share your work with anyone and everyone is geared towards like being able to get that result, right? And everyone is on board on that. So, any questions so far? Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. All right, let's just take a look. All right. So the question is, can you recommend some good issue and PR templates for my personal projects? So yeah, the one that you have shared, and then Eddie, a huge shout out to Eddie as well. He is a open source advocate and one of the most well-known personalities within the entire open source ecosystem, right? Okay, and the next question is how to get started with Outreachy. So Outreachy is a program that is primarily focused on the underrepresented, parts of the tech. So in case if you feel that you are as one of the underrepresented parts of tech, then you can apply for outreach. It's very similar to the these GitHub, let's say, I mean, the other examples like Google Summer of Code and all, as well, right? You can take a look at MLHacks fellowship as well. So in case you feel that, then you can just fill up the envelope, right? That application that you need in order to successfully get started with outreaching. So I hope that answers my question. But there are any other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section. And then we'll just take up those questions as well. Now, just to kind of give a understanding of how one should basically contribute to open source. Of course, if we come back to our repository that we were creating, right? So we basically were trying to create a new repository that we had called, and let me just see if that is there. Okay. Yeah, so let's go ahead and create a new repository, right? Let's just go ahead and do that, which is this GDSC demo. And now, of course, what I'll just do is I'll just create a README right now, and I'll go ahead and create a README very quickly. Now, of course, if you wish to basically contribute to any project, right, it's also just important to understand on a high level how GitHub works. So basically, on GitHub, you have any public repository, so it's accessible by anyone. Now, of course, whosoever is the main owner of that particular repository is the only person who can directly make changes to that particular project. In case you don't own that particular project, if you try to make some changes, then it won't happen. Now, what you could do instead is that that will allow you to basically go ahead and so instead of doing this like the other way, the other thing that you could do is that you could clone or basically fork this particular project, right? So you see the symbol of fork, The fork basically what it does is that it creates a copy of the same project in your account as well, and you are using the forked copy, whereas the original copy is with me, right? So that is also something that can be done, right? And again, the main idea is that yeah. So the main idea that we were discussing is that with fork you'll be able to make changes to your own local copy. Now let's say that you have made some changes. In case you want to basically request those changes to be uh, accepted by me, right? So you can basically work on something known as a pull request. A pull request is basically means that if someone external who doesn't have access to your repository, and it's also, I mean, you can use it internally, and you can also create a pull request on in your own repository if you don't want to push the code directly. So pull request basically means that there are some code changes or some file changes that have happened. Now someone is requesting that, like, these changes be added, right? So that they can be reflected as well for better uniformity. I hope this makes sense to everyone. So that's the main idea behind the pull request. So now what we can try to do is that for those folks who are live right now, right? The main idea is that in case you want to contribute specifically towards the if you want to contribute specifically towards like open source right now, right, and towards Hacktoberfest. So the way to basically do it is that you first go ahead and register yourself on Hacktoberfest, and then across GitHub, right, what you can do is that across GitHub you can search for repositories which have the Hacktoberfest tag, right? So basically, whenever you create any project, you can add some tags to it or topics to it. So let's say if I add, let's say Hacktoberfest, right? If I do this, right, and it will basically, what will happen is that people, whosoever is taking a look at the Hacktoberfest tag, you can contribute to that particular repository, right? So I'll just remove this tag for this one. So you can see, right, that there are a number of different repositories which have this tag, and what that means is that this particular repository becomes eligible to participate in the Hacktoberfest, right? So, in order for you to successfully pass through the Hacktoberfest, you need to contribute to a particular repository which has the Hacktoberfest label or has the Hacktoberfest tag, right? And as soon as you do that, then you have basically contributed to an eligible repository. If it does not have the Hacktoberfest tag, then it won't be counted towards it. This is something to keep in mind. Again, if anyone has any questions so far, feel free to ask in the Q&A section. If anyone has any queries, feel free to ask in the Q&A section. And if everything is clear, would love to know again your thoughts about how are you finding the session. So in case if you're finding it interesting, feel free to also share that. So you can also type in the chat. Let's take a look. Okay, perfect. So yeah, I mean, those are some of the main things. And again, we can take up some questions right now. Or if there are no questions, then of course you can always connect with me on my on my Twitter account. I'm fairly active on Twitter. So let me actually stop sharing and bring that up. Let me share that again. Just give me 1 second. Yeah. So in case if you are interested to connect with me, I'll just also drop in my Twitter over here. So it's Twitter how to develop. In case you want to connect with me, you can connect me over here. But again, as next steps for all of you, learn Git. In case you haven't learned Git already, start with the programming language. For specifically for Hacktoberfest, go to the Hacktoberfest website, sign up with your GitHub account, and look for repositories online on GitHub which have the Hacktoberfest section. And definitely, one thing that I'll recommend to all of you is go through the specifically when it comes to the participation, go through the all the guidelines that are there, right? Because if you don't follow the guidelines, then you'll be disqualified. So there's something to keep in mind. But yeah, with that, I'll like to conclude today's session. Again, in case you are interested, you can connect with me on Twitter, and just keep in mind that you go through all these different guidelines that are there for Hacktoberfest. Yeah, let me also share the link of the PPT once again. There you go. I've also shared that.
Since there are no more questions, I think we can conclude the event. I would
Yeah.
like to thank you, sir, for taking out time from your busy schedule and presenting us with such an informative webinar. We hope this answered the doubts of participants regarding open source development and Hacktoberfest, and you all had a great learning experience at this webinar. Looking forward to organizing more such events for you in the future. Those who wish to connect with Sir, the link to his Twitter and LinkedIn handle will be given in the chat box.
Yeah, I'll recommend Twitter because I'm not that active on LinkedIn. So I'll recommend if you can connect with me on Twitter.
Yes, I guess that was it from our side. So thank you again, Shivay, for joining us. It was a very great session. I guess you covered all of the topics very well. And guys, we have all the important links in the chat section if you can see. So go ahead and connect with Shivay there. He's more active on Twitter, as you just said. And you'll get the recording of the session on your WhatsApp group if you have joined. So I'll be sharing the recording of the session there. Uh, so yeah, that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being there.